Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the first training of a wide series in a wider series titled Defending Human Rights in a Fractured World. And today's training is going to be focusing specifically on the foundations of human rights. But as the months go on, we're going to be engaging in a series of discussions and trainings that look at human rights, advocacy, and justice in a world that is increasingly complex and a world that is increasingly divided as well. And so today's session is very, very basic, very, very foundational, but very essential in truly understanding human rights and what they mean and what they are to us in our communities. So before we actually understand what human rights are, we need to understand why we're here. Firstly, we are here because human rights is something that we speak about, but it's something that is not always fully understood. Secondly, we're here because injustice is something that exists in our communities. And thirdly, we're here because of the fact that we need to fully understand human rights in order to be able to respond to injustice with clarity. And that's what we're really aiming to do today. We're going to do this by understanding the fundamental human rights, and then also by understanding the different ways in which we can respond to injustice. So now we've understood why we're here. We've understood the basics. We settled, and we understand what we are going to be speaking about today. So let's get right to it. Firstly, we need to define what human rights are. And in order to do that, we need to understand what is a human. And please feel free. It's a very, very simple answer, and don't overcomplicate it. So the first word that comes into your mind when you think of a human, what is it? So a human is you, me, adult, child, person. Simple as that. And the simpler, the better when it comes to defining this. A lot of the time, we find that in our societies, people overcomplicate what a human is. And that allows for injustice to creep its way into our communities. So when I mentioned what a human is, did I mention where you live? No. Did I mention anything about religion? No. And I mentioned that because of the fact that it really is that simple. It is you, me, adult, child, person. Can we all say that together? You, me, adult, child, person. And we need to understand that there is no category to make you less human or more human. There's nothing that we can do to categorize what a human is. It's really as simple. And as people who are working in places where injustice is easily finding itself in, we need to understand the simplicity of what a human is when we're dealing with human rights. And so now we've understood what a human is. What is the second part of the word? What is a right? So a right is freedoms and entitlement based on a specific grouping. So it's something that you are essentially allowed to claim. And so when I speak of based on a specific grouping, I mean that the rights that we are often able to claim are usually under specific groups. So you have, for example, workers' rights, women's rights, children's rights, earth rights, and all of these are based on specific groupings. What that means is if you are not part of that group, you are not allowed to claim the rights that are under that group. And so if you are over the age of 18, can you claim children's rights? No. If you are someone who is human, can you claim earth rights? No. And so that is exactly what it means. It means that if you are not part of that group, you cannot claim the rights to that group. But there is one group that I think we should all be able to claim the rights to. Unless, of course, one of us has decided that we're not identifying as a human today. Maybe you're identifying as a tree. I don't know. But if we are all on the same page and we're all saying that we're humans, then we should all be able to claim human rights. So we've now defined what a human is. We've defined that a human is you, me, adult, child, person. We've defined that a right is freedoms and entitlements that you are allowed, freedom and entitlements based on specific grouping. Let's put that together. What are human rights? So here, the simpler, the better. Human rights are rights that you deserve simply because you are a human. And as I've been emphasizing, it really, really is that simple. And we really, really should keep it that simple. The simpler, the better. And the more simple, the less likely you are able to allow injustice in your community as well. So we now understand what human rights are. There are certain characteristics to human rights. So firstly, human rights are inherent, meaning that they are natural, they're essential. This means that there's nothing that you can do to earn humanity, to earn access and gain access to human rights. It's simply something that is natural because of the fact that you were born a human. So it's regardless of your nationality, it's regardless of your place of residence, your gender, your identity, your sex. It is simply because you are human. Secondly, human rights are all connected. That means if someone is denied access to one human right, then they are denied access to another human right. Another human right is therefore affected. And human rights are all equal, and we should, as humans, be able to claim all of these things set out in our rights. And we'll get to that in a second, what those rights are. But we should be able to gain access to all the human rights that we know of. And so where are human rights found? Where can we find them legally in legal documents? So firstly, we have the founding document of human rights, which is the United Declaration of Human Rights. And this is a document that was adopted by the United Nations. And in there, we have 30 fundamental rights. Very, very important, 30 fundamental rights. And these rights are usually form the basis of a lot of rights in certain constitutions. So you'll find that in your country's constitution, there are maybe 26 or less human rights from the Declaration of Human Rights. But each constitution has to have at least some of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in them. Then the second place that you can find human rights in are, as I mentioned, your constitution. So your constitution, I don't know what your constitution specifically looks like in your community, but take a look at it if you haven't looked at your constitution recently, and see how many of these human rights, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, can you find in your constitution. I know for myself, it's also been something that I've had to do recently and actually look at it and say, oh, how many human rights from the United Declaration of Human Rights are in my constitution. And I think it's a really good practice for us to all do in our communities as well. So those are the two places that you can find the human rights in legal documents. So you would have heard previously that I mentioned how many fundamental human rights we have. Do any of you remember how many there were from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights? I mean, I just mentioned it, so I hope you do remember. So we have 30 fundamental human rights. And that is very, very important to remember. And I just want to ask, does anyone perhaps know all 30 fundamental human rights? So what we can do together is name the different fundamental human rights that you know. It can be one, it can be all 30. But you can just take a second here to pause before we go on and name the amount of human rights that you know, the fundamental human rights that you know. Okay, so these are all 30 fundamental human rights. We're all born free and equal. Simple as that. And that really sets the foundation for the rest of the human rights to come. Don't discriminate. The right to life, no slavery, no torture. You have rights no matter where you go. This is a right that we often forget, actually, when we are going about our daily lives. People often forget that you have rights regardless of where you go. We're all equal before the law. Your human rights are protected by the law. No unfair detainment, the right to trial. We're all always innocent till proven guilty. The right to privacy, freedom to move. Another one that I think we forget in today's society. The right to seek a safe place to live. Right to a nationality, marriage and family. The right to your own things, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, the right to public assembly, the right to democracy. And the right to democracy is one that I think, as someone who is South African, is very meaningful because of the fact that our country only gained full democracy around 30 plus years ago. So we are very, very young within our democracy. And that just tells you how we shouldn't take these rights for granted, because some people still don't have access to that even today. Some people don't have access to the right to life or the right to democracy, right? And then 22, social security, workers' rights, the right to play, which is one that, you know, I think as adults, we can actually also take ownership of and practice our right to play. Food and shelter for all, the right to shelter, or rather the right to education, copyright, a fair and free world, responsibility, and no one can take your rights away. That is a right in of itself, that no one can take your rights away. No one can take away your human rights. Right. So those are all 30 fundamental human rights. And I just want to ask you, in your communities, is this something that people have access to? Do people in your communities have access to all 30 human rights? If not, which rights do you see people not having access to in your communities out of these 30? So that's something we really have to think of, and that's something that should anger us if people in our communities don't have access to even one of these human rights. That's something that really, really should spark a sense, a desire for justice within our communities as well. And so as people who are working in spaces where we are advocating for justice, we should really make sure that we know all 30 human rights, fundamental human rights, because knowledge is power. And so when we have the knowledge of what our human rights are, we can hold the leaders in our communities accountable for keeping these human rights. And so now we've spoken about human rights, we've spoken about the human rights that we have access to. Now, that gap between rights and the reality that we just spoke of how some people in our communities don't have access to rights, that gap is injustice. When you have access to human rights, that's justice. When you do not have access to human rights, that is injustice, simply put. And so this affects many people. It affects individuals, it affects families, it affects communities. And we've seen this today in our own societies. And I need us to remember that injustice is not something that is random. It has certain causes. And as soon as we see this in our society and we see injustice embedding itself in the way in which we operate in society, that becomes systemic injustice. Systemic injustice is essentially when opportunities are unfairly distributed. Some people thrive while others barely survive. And as that happens, over a long period of time, as that continues to repeat itself, that becomes systemic injustice. For example, where I'm staying in South Africa, we had apartheid from 1948 to 1994. That was a long period of time where people of color were not allowed access to basic human rights. And that was a legal system that was created by the government at the time. And that system allowed for injustice to be put within our society. And it was making it possible for our rights to be violated, for the people of this country's rights to be violated. And that is systemic injustice. It's when injustice is allowed to thrive in certain communities, in a certain society. Another example is how women of color sometimes don't have access to proper healthcare, because the healthcare system and the healthcare educational system does not teach people on how to handle women of color as well. And so that becomes a system where women of color do not have access to proper healthcare. That's systemic injustice. That's something that we're seeing in many, many countries globally. So those are just different ways in which we find systemic injustice and find injustice in general in our society. And as I said, this results in some people thriving while others barely survive. And that's an issue. So we've spoken a lot now, and I think it's time for us to have a group activity. So you can get into groups of whatever amount, depending on how many people are in the room, or you can do this as a collective group as well. But really what we're doing here is looking at certain fundamental human rights and answering these 3 questions. So what does this right mean? Why does this right matter? Does everyone in my community or country have access to this right? And these are the different rights. So you can distribute this depending on how many people are in your group at the moment. And you can use all the rights, you can use one of them depending on how many of you are there. I hope that we really are able to ask these questions about all 30 fundamental human rights in our own time. I want us to really continue to reflect on this and continue to think about this when we're thinking about all the rights, in order to see what injustice is present in our communities, and find ways in which we can fight against that. Now, speaking of finding ways in which we can fight and challenge injustice, how do you in your community fight injustice? It doesn't have to be something big that you do, like speaking to the president, but it can be, giving clothes to someone. It can be teaching a class on anti-racism. Different ways in which you fight and challenge injustice in your community. Now, you'll find that most of the ways in which we fight injustice fall under at least one of these 3 categories. And those 3 categories form the ways in which we can challenge injustice. There's 3 mechanisms, and they are all very, very important in challenging injustice. And we're going to speak about that for a little while. Firstly, it's raising awareness. So raising awareness is essentially about educating. It's basically about informing. It's about making people aware and making injustice visible. And basically what this does is it helps people understand what is happening and why it matters. This is very important because a large part of why people are not fighting against injustice is because they don't even know that it's present in the first place. There's many forms of injustice happening globally, but some people don't even know that that's happening. And not only globally, but in their own communities. So this helps people, raising awareness helps people to get out of their bubble and see the injustice that's happening outside of their own space. So there's different ways in which you can do this. You can use media campaigns, you can do educational workshops, which I know a lot of people do as well. You can post on social platforms, make events around educating people. And, a strong example of this is a social media campaign that you can do to highlight the effects of climate change. A lot of people don't know about climate change in general. So by doing a small social media campaign, you'll be educating a lot of people on that. Or you can even share pictures on WhatsApp about a certain social issue or a certain form of injustice that's happening in your community. These are all ways that you, as an individual, can fight and challenge injustice. Very simple, but very effective. The second mechanism of challenging injustice that we have is charity. Now, charity relates to basically immediate support. It relates to meeting urgent needs and basically providing immediate relief to support people in need. It's a very necessary but short-term way of fighting against injustice. The different ways that you can do this is by donating money, by donating clothes or food or resources to really help people who are living in certain forms of crisis. And a specific example of this is the sisters within the IPA in the Philippines who gave food and shelter to the community members in the area who were affected by the recent typhoon. Another example is organizing a food drive for a community that's affected by a natural disaster. These are different ways in which we as a community can practice charity. And I know that we as the IPA are very, very good at providing forms of charity to people in need. And it's a very important way of challenging injustice as well. So now that we've looked at charity, we've looked at raising awareness as well, we now have one final way of challenging injustice. And this form of challenging injustice is very important because I want to give you an example. We have a man who is homeless. We tell people in our communities about that man who's homeless. We give him food, we give him shelter, and he has, a better life now. But at the end of the day, homelessness is still an issue. We still have homelessness as an issue in our society. He was not the only person who was homeless. So what we need to do is get rid of homelessness completely. That's exactly where advocacy comes in. Advocacy relates to creating long-term systemic change by influencing policies and social structures and by really understanding the root cause of an issue as opposed to only looking at the symptoms. For example, looking at the lack of shelter or lack of food that we looked at with the example of the homeless man. Different ways you can do this are lobbying for legislative changes, participating in policy discussions, influencing decision makers, and really advocating for people in spaces where they are experiencing injustice. A specific example is advocating for prison reform by pushing for changes in sentencing laws. And these three mechanisms are all very, very important in challenging injustice. But advocacy itself is more long-term, and it really looks at getting rid of the issue completely. So now what we can do is do another group activity. And this activity basically relates to looking at how we can improve access to the rights that we spoke about in our previous activity through raising awareness, through charity, through advocacy. And so I want us to go into the same groups that we had and to look at the same policies and the same right rather that we looked at, and look at how we can improve access to those rights through raising awareness, through charity, and through advocacy. So now that we've looked at the different ways in which to challenge injustice, I want us to imagine a river. And I am on the side of this river. And as I'm on the side of the river, I see a lot of people in the river drowning. And so as I see this, I get the people out of the river. I mend to their wounds. basically help them not drown. And as time goes, I see that more people are drowning in the river. As much as I can try and get them out, more people are continuing to drown in this river. So what I do is I call other people to help. I call you to help me. I call other community members to come and help get these people out of the river. But as time goes on, we see that as much as we're trying to get people out of this river, more people are still falling into this river and drowning, basically. And so what we then try to do is we walk alongside the river and really try to look at the root problem. One of us asks, why are people falling into the river in the first place? And as we walk to the end of the river over here, we see that no, the reason why people are falling into this river is because the bridge that was supposed to make the path to this river and across this river safe is actually broken. Someone, a leader in the community, misused the money to fix that bridge. And so what we do as community members is we actually make sure that we fix this river. And so really what this analogy shows is, firstly, by calling you and by calling other community members, I raised awareness about this issue. Secondly, by getting people outside of this river and saving them, we practice charity. And thirdly, by asking why are people falling into the river in the first place, and by fixing the bridge, we practiced advocacy. All three of these mechanisms were very important in making sure that the people of this community were saved from drowning in the river. Now, this is just a small analogy, but very effective in showing that all three mechanisms are very important. But also, it shows that we shouldn't just stop here in the downstream by charity. We shouldn't stop by raising awareness, but we should actually continue to the end and continue upstream and ask the question of why is this issue happening in the first place, to make sure that we get rid of the issue completely. Because what I want us to understand is, as we saw here with this analogy, I couldn't save everyone in the river. We couldn't save everyone in the river. And so that's exactly what ends up happening in our communities. We can't save everyone from injustice on our own. What we then need to do is we need to get rid of the injustice in our societies completely. And that's where advocacy comes in. And that's why advocacy is so important. And so I really want us to end off with remembering the fact that advocacy is a very, very important aspect of our challenge in our system in challenging injustice. Thank you so much for joining us for this training. I really hope that it was successful in equipping you in understanding human rights and understanding the ways in which to challenge human rights. Bye-bye.